and everybody's eyes are up here. We talked about this before when we did City of Ember, and we did a whole packet, or whole part of our packet on types of conflict. What is conflict? What's conflict, Helen?
It's like an argument.
Like an argument, or it could just even be a struggle.
Yeah.
So sometimes we see an argument happening, and we say, oh, that's a conflict. Sometimes it may be a conflict with weather. Like, we don't argue with the weather if it's raining and we don't want it to. We don't stand out there at the window and yell at the weather. But that could be a conflict. Today we're going to look at 4 different kinds of conflict. The first one is easy, man versus man. Now, we've talked about this before, Lauren. Could it be a girl versus a girl?
Yes.
Could it be a girl versus a boy? Man versus man is just a universal terminology. Does that make sense? This way, as you get older, okay, as you get older, it's man versus man all the time, not just, thank you, not just man versus girl. Because what would happen when you got to college? Evan, you need to stop with that, please. Please, 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 put down the pencil. What would happen if you got to college and Joseph walks in to his freshman college course of literature, and he opens up his novel and he says, this is a perfect example of man versus man. And Liliana wasn't taught the same way, and she says, the book's about 2 girls. What are you talking about? Is anybody going to be able to have a good conversation about it at that point, or are you going to start fighting over words? Fighting over words. So what they do in literature is they make the words consistent all the way through, so everybody knows man versus man means person versus person. Does that help a little bit? A lot of years 5th graders get very stuck on that. Don't be stuck. Man versus man. Man versus self. Have you ever been annoyed with yourself?
Yeah.
That's a man versus self conflict. Even as a female, that's a man versus self conflict. So if you're having a struggle and you're the only one who can fix it, like maybe you're struggling to understand math. Really, you're the only one who can fix that conflict. It's you versus yourself. More often, though, these kind of conflicts, man versus self, are about making the right decisions. Lena, in City of Ember, had a little bit of a man versus self conflict when she heard the price of the colored pencils. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
And she thought of all the other things, Giada, that money could buy. And she thought, no, I still want the colored pencils. But when you see that conflict in literature, they're like, ooh, what's the right thing to do? That's man versus self. Man versus nature. These are some cool survival stories. Anybody ever read Hatchet? Man versus nature. Where somebody's trying to survive. They can be dramatic like that, or they can be like, it's raining and you don't want to go to the car and get wet. Anything with nature that we can't control. Yes?
I watched a movie about a person being on Mars, and would that be like a...
I would think so. Man versus nature could include like Mars or something like that if that's where the setting of the story is. Yeah, nature is wherever it is. Man versus society. We saw this in City of Ember too, didn't we?
Mm-hmm.
Because it was Lena and June versus the mayor and the way that things were set up. There are 4 main types of conflict we're looking at. Man versus man, man versus self, man versus nature, and man versus society. Yes?
Can you have like 2 people fighting 2 people, or like 2 people fighting 1 person?
Yep. Yeah, whenever it's, as long as it's not a big group thing, right? So like, Lena, when she was mad at Lizzie and Looper, that'd be man versus man.
Like,
even though it was Lizzie and Looper.
so it can't be like 10 people or something.
Yeah, if it's a bigger group, you're kind of getting into more society. Yes?
When the guys were chasing June and Lena, was that man versus man or man versus society?
When the guards were chasing them, I would say that was probably more man versus society because they weren't chasing them as individual people. Like, we don't know the names of the guards. It wasn't like Joe and Bob and Harry all went chasing them because they were mad at them for like something they had said. They were following the directions of the mayor. And the mayor is kind of a society person. Yes?
If there's like a book or like a movie, or like when Lena and Dune saw the fox, what would that be? Like with an animal in it?
Well, if the fox had attacked them, it would be man versus nature. Them just watching the fox is not a conflict. Does that make sense? So you can see things without being a conflict. I can see that there's a storm out forming, right? I can see that. I don't have a conflict with that storm. I can know that it's there. Lucas?
If it's like a dog like biting a person, is that going to be man versus man or man versus man?
If it's a dog, then that's nature. And it's always man versus nature, even if the dog is attacking man. But again, the goal is the common language. Does that make sense? And just think how confusing it would be if we did not use a common language. Because then you'd be like, no, this City of Ember book is a clear example of Lena versus the mayor. Well, no, if somebody hasn't read that book, they won't know what that means. Can you have a conversation like this using these words about books that other people haven't read? Yeah. Yes, sir.
If the man was chasing a man, would that be society since he controls the whole place?
Depends on why he's chasing her. If he's chasing her because she said, I don't like you, or I don't like the color car you drive, then that's man versus man. This is where it gets tricky, but I like that question, yes.
Hey, if there's like a book like about like a whole like animals like life like how they live and stuff, would that still be man versus nature?
Well, again, Giada, you're asking great questions, but you need to watch for the conflict. Conflict is a problem or a fight between two people or two things. Conflict is not really, like, we can see that there are bad things in the world. There's war happening in the world right now. That's a conflict. But it's not me versus that. Like, I can know that it's there, but if it's not in the story, it's not what we're talking about. Does that make a little bit more sense?
It's like if it was a fable, wouldn't an animal fighting an animal like be tough? Wouldn't that be like a man versus man?
It would probably be man versus man if it's like a fable and all the characters are fictional. Yes.
Would a man versus a monster be man versus nature?
It depends on the context, but from what I'm thinking with the Percy Jacksons, yeah, I would say that's probably man versus nature. Because the monsters are usually creatures of the gods, which are part of the, like, it's not a human versus human.
How come they don't have animal versus animal, or why don't they have those types of?
Well, you could say it was animal versus animal, but again, we're going back to that common language. We have to use broad terms so everybody understands what it means. And by broad terms, that's exactly what I mean, is like man. Instead of saying boy, girl, young lady, teenager versus teenager. It makes it easier just so everybody can summarize out what's happening. Does that make sense? It's also easier for you learning it. Because as you're learning it, you're not like, well, wait, was this man versus young man? Is this teenager? Well, they're 12, so they're not quite a teenager yet. Is it? But they're not quite a kid yet. It takes a lot of that gray area out and makes it man versus man. Does that help? Okay. So man versus man versus self, those are those internal struggles you have about what's right or wrong or how to change something that maybe. Man versus self could even be somebody who wants to learn to run a marathon and has to like make themselves get up and run every day. Does that make sense? You want to get better at basketball, you're going to practice every day. Nobody's stopping you from being better at basketball, but it's a challenge you or the character has to overcome. Man versus nature. Anything that's not human is nature. Fair? But there has to be a conflict. There has to be a conflict. A conflict is a fight or a problem or a disagreement of some kind. Man versus society. Society is like big picture. They were fighting the City of Ember. Lena and Dune were fighting the City of Ember. We haven't really gotten far enough into Bad Beginnings to really see a lot of conflict yet, right? We've seen some problems happening, right? We've seen the problems. I mean, their parents died in a fire. That's a problem, but it's not really like, It's not the same thing as a conflict. It's a plot event. But a conflict is a problem between two people. A conflict typically has some form of resolution, a way to fix it. Fair enough? So this is on your seesaw. Remember, red, orange, green, and blue. Make sure that when you're doing this, the green is very green and the blue is very blue. Hold on. There are actually 6 boxes, but only 4 types of conflict. What does that tell you? Giada?
That there's 2 of them.
2 of them will be used more than one time. Yes. Yeah, you can use a light green. Just make sure that the green and blue look very different. And also same thing for the red and orange. Go ahead, cut.